Hello, this is our Top 6 American Revolution podcast. Today we will be discussing the top 6 most important acts, wars, and events that changed the American Revolution. The topics we will be discussing are the French-Indian War, no taxation without representation, the Stamp Act, the Quartering Act, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, and our unit question, why do people rebel? Hope you enjoy, and let's jump into it! Okay.
The French and Indian War was the basic foundation of the push toward the American Revolution. In 1763, the French and Indian War ended, leaving the British and colonial militia victorious. France was kicked out of colonial America. With the French pushed further back, the British had all of the power. War cost lots of money, so they had large war debts. The British did not want their citizens to pay it, so King George III demanded the colonies to do it instead. King George III started out with the Proclamation of 1763. This document stated that the colonists were not allowed to pass a western border. The western border was the Appalachian Mountains. The colonists got mad because that stopped expansion of settlement. King George III did not stop there. The British introduced the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and the Tea Act, which were taxes on the colonists' essential and favorite goods. The reason for these acts was because the British had to pay off the French and Indian War debts. Big events such as the Boston Tea Party and Boston Massacre would enrage the colonists and set the stage for the American Revolution.
And now moving on to no taxation without representation. This slogan, no taxation without representation, coined by Sons of Liberty in the 1750s and 60s, presents a real wrong or conflict towards the American colonists. In the 13 colonies, which was one of the major causes of the American Revolution, the Stamp Act had laws that you'd have to buy stamped items and add taxes to such items. The purpose of the slogan was to make sure American merchants wouldn't buy British trades and goods, which was known as the non-importation agreements. The colonists were outraged by these laws. Although there were basic rights by the British established after the Magna Carta of 1215 and the Glorious Revolution. Since the colonists were not represented in Parliament, some of the colonists protested that Parliament had no rights to tax them.
The Stamp Act was made by the British Parliament on March 22, 1765. The Stamp Act made the American colonists pay a tax on every piece of printed paper they used. They also had to pay for ships' papers, legal documents, licensed newspapers, and even playing cards. The colonists thought that they should not have to pay for something that they had been getting free for years. Also, the Stamp Act was a way to raise money for England, but taxes did not normally go to England. The people were scared that the next taxes would be passed in the future would be the same way. In response to the Stamp Act, they responded with violence. When the British government saw the reaction, they took the Stamp Act away and stopped all payment for stamps on printed paper. Tarring and feathering was a punishment that was used in the Middle Ages. Tarring and feathering was when tar was poured on someone and feathers were poured on them also. After that, they would tear the feathers off, and with the feathers would come tar and skin. Sons of Liberty were a group that began to go against the Stamp Act. The Sons of Liberty was a secret political organization in the American colonies before the American Revolution that protested against British taxes and laws. The Sons of Liberty was formed in response to the Stamp Act. They harassed the stamp tax distributors who worked for the British government. Many quit their jobs because they were scared of the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty also protested on the street. The Sons of Liberty had to meet secretly so that they would not be arrested by the British soldiers.
Let's now move into the Quartering Act. The Quartering Act is the act passed by the British Parliament saying that people in the American colonies had to house the British troops and supply them with food. This act was imposed to prove the assertion of British authority over the colonists. It was also passed because Parliament was mad at the colonists had ruled over their other intolerable acts. This act was passed on May 15, 1765. There were some British officers who had fought in the French and Indian War, and they wanted certain assemblies to pay for the quartering and furnishing of their troops. So, the chief of the British North American troops, General Thomas Gage, asked Parliament if he could fix the problem. This issue was controversial because the colonists had housed the British soldiers if there was a war going on, but since this was a time where there was peace, the colonists did not think it was fair. Of course, this is not what General Thomas Gage had in mind, but Parliament was just trying to get back at the colonists. Although many of the people in the American colonies did not agree when this law was passed, most of the resisting occurred in New York and Boston. The people of New York argued that it wasn't fair for them to house and pay the cost of British troops, and they were probably the ones who had to quarter the most troops. And ironically, in Boston, Also, Boston held lots of resisting too, which is where the Boston Massacre occurred in 1770. The colonists finally argued enough so that the law was eventually expired on the date of March 24, 1767.
The massacre was a street fight that occurred on March 5, 1770, between a patriot group throwing snowball stones and sticks and a group of British soldiers. Several colonists were killed, and this led to a campaign by speechwriters to wake the madness of the citizens. The company of British troops in the city of Boston was increasingly unwelcome. The riot began when about 50 citizens attacked a British guard. A British officer, Captain Thomas Preston, called in more soldiers, and these soldiers were also attacked. So the soldiers fired into the group, killing 3 people on the spot and injuring 8 others. 2 of them died later on. A town meeting was called, demanding the removal of the British and the trial of Captain Preston and his men for murder. At the trial, John Adams and Joshua Quincy II defended the British, leading to their clearing and release. Samuel Quincy and Robert Treat Paine were the attorneys for the prosecution. Later, 2 of the British soldiers were found guilty of manslaughter. The Boston Massacre was a signal event leading to the Revolutionary War. It led directly to the royal governor evacuating and occupying the town of Boston. It would soon bring the Revolution to armed rebellion throughout the colonies. A famous engraving by Paul Revere that is used as propaganda throughout the colonies. This engraving is an image of what the Boston Massacre would have looked like, but misleading the colonies to think very poorly on what the British did, shown in the image.
Hello, today I'll be speaking about the Boston Tea Party and why it was one of the biggest parts of the American Revolution. The Revolution lasted for 8 years, 1775 to 1783, and the Boston Tea Party took place on December 16, 1773. The Boston Tea Party was a precursor to the Revolution. It was said to be a political protest involving Sam Adams with many other American colonists on the other side, which was the British. How did the Boston Tea Party start? The Tea Act went into effect on May 10, 1773. This is the act that required American colonists to only purchase British tea. This tea in the end was cheaper than other teas, but the British put tax on it. This led to the colonists to protest against the British, which then was the cause of the Boston Tea Party. The British had previously taxed other items such as sugar and playing cards. After this happened, the colonists revolted. What happened the night of the attack? A cold night on December 16, 1773, the American colonists had disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians. The colonists fled onto their ships and soon dumped 342 tea containers. The Indians weren't looking to hurt the British. They weren't looking to wreck any part of their ship. All they wanted to do was to dump all the tea. What did the party all lead to? The controversy led to the passage of the Punitive Coercive Acts of 1774 and the Intolerable Acts of 1774. These 2 acts then brought the sides closer to war. The Boston Tea Party also left King George III furious. In the end of the Boston Tea Party was one of the top 5 most important parts of the American Revolution. It was a precursor that had the 2 sides despising each other, creating the American Revolution.
And now to the unit question, why do people rebel? The definition of rebel is a person who rises in opposition or armed resistance against an established government or ruler. This means that if a person is not liking what the government or ruler is providing, then they would fight against that. People rebel to show what is right. People rebel to fight for what they believe in. People rebel because they want to make a difference from what was given. Teenagers today rebel because they don't want to do what their parents tell them to do. For instance, if an adult tells a child to do something and the child does not want to do it for any reason, then the child might rebel against the adult. In history, an example of rebel was when the British taxed the Americans to get the money they owed them from the French and Indian War. The Americans rebelled against the British because they didn't want to pay the taxes the British were giving them. This led to all the events from 1775 to 1783.
Thanks for watching. This podcast was by
Alexa Zellner,
Paola Macias,
Paris Zapp,
Megan Pillsbury,
Alana Webster,
Ursula Wolf,
and Jocelyn Lozano.
See ya.